In 1998, as Indonesia was gripped by political chaos, a bizarre panic swept through East Java. Rumors spread of mysterious black-clad ninjas prowling at night and eliminating anyone deemed a sorcerer. Fear took hold, and people began to take matters into their own hands. Neighbors turned vigilante, and innocent people were caught in the crossfire. By the end of the year, over 300 people had been slain in what became known as the East Java Ninja Scare. A devastating economic crisis had triggered unrest, and in May 1998, the 32-year authoritarian rule of President Suharto collapsed amid violent riots. Indonesia's old order's collapse left a power vacuum and lawlessness in its wake. In this climate, social and sectarian tensions flared, and trust in authorities was badly shaken. Security forces struggled to maintain control, and communities took security into their own hands. Equally important was the cultural backdrop in East Java. In rural East Java, belief in witchcraft, known locally as Dukun Santet, runs deep. Many attributed misfortunes, illness, crop failure, and unexplained deaths to hidden sorcerers in their midst. During previous times of national and local upheaval, the focus on evil wizards had blown up into attacks on these so-called magic users. By 1998, with trust in society fraying and superstition strong, conditions were ripe for a new outbreak of violence fueled by fear. The scare truly ignited in early 1998 in East Java's Banyuwangi Regency, which is roughly the equivalent of a state in Indonesia. After cattle mysteriously died, locals in the village of Kaligondo suspected black magic was behind it. Suspicion fell on a local man, and on February 4th, 1998, a mob took matters into its own hands and hanged him publicly as a sorcerer. This brutal act sparked a wider spree. In the following months, vigilante groups roamed the countryside, targeting anyone rumored to practice dark magic. Clad in black, these self-styled witch hunters struck in secret, earning the nickname ninjas for both their stealth and for their clothing. The victims included not just alleged sorcerers, but also local community leaders accused of not being harsh enough on local wizards. Keep this in mind because one of the darker theories of this event turns upon the ninjas targeting these community leaders. The violence escalated through the middle of 1998, peaking in August and September with roughly 100 alleged sorcerers slain. Only in October did security forces finally intervene, arresting many perpetrators and halting this initial witch hunt. Strangely, this wasn't the end of the ninja panic, but merely the start of it, and soon everyone would be seeing ninjas everywhere. As the original ninjas were being rounded up, a new wave of fear gripped East Java. Many locals came to believe that the ninja assassins were now prowling the region, targeting religious leaders. Rumors claimed that traditional Muslim clerics were being targeted by the ninjas. For those who are unaware, Indonesia is a Muslim-majority country and the largest Muslim country in the world by population. Local newspapers fanned the flames, with early October 1998 headlines warning of ninja squads targeting these local religious figures. Terrified villagers responded by fortifying their neighborhoods. They set up night guard posts, arming themselves with makeshift weapons, and barricading roads after dark to keep out strangers. Mass hysteria took hold, and panicked villagers reported seeing ninjas everywhere. In the minds of many Javanese, the ninjas had actually adopted the powers of the sorcerers they initially sought to hunt. For instance, there's documented eyewitness accounts of black-clad figures leaping over rooftops, transforming into cats or other animals, and turning invisible. The terror was palpable and often irrational. Every person out wandering at night immediately became the target of suspicion. And by suspicion, I mean that anyone caught out after dark took the very serious risk of being beaten to death by angry mobs. The Javanese authorities detained hundreds of mentally ill people for their own safety, fearing they would be mistaken for ninjas by paranoid crowds. By October and November, reports of gruesome vigilante executions flooded in. In one village, 5 men were seized and gruesomely slain, with their heads mounted on stakes as a warning to other so-called ninjas. Elsewhere, suspects were burned at the stake, or their bodies dragged through the street amid chants from crowds celebrating their lust for ninja death. In a further tragedy, innocent pets were also targeted under the belief that they were actually ninjas who had adopted an animal form for reasons of stealth. Almost none of the vigilantes were ever brought to justice, and experts are still studying what exactly happened over 25 years later. One popular explanation is that the scare was essentially an outbreak of mass hysteria, a collective delusion born of fear and superstition. Villagers genuinely believed supernatural assassins lurked in the shadows. Overwhelmed by panic, they even imagined ninjas could fly or turn invisible, and struck out at anyone who seemed suspicious. Another view is that vigilante justice amid social breakdown was the main driver. With the chaos of 1998, police authority was weak, and villagers felt unprotected against perceived evil forces. As mentioned earlier in this segment, East Java already had occasional witch hunts, whenever misfortune was blamed on a sorcerer. The ninja scare can thus be seen as a violent chain reaction from that pattern, magnified by the turmoil and societal breakdown of 1998 in Indonesia. In this view, those who committed the slayings sincerely believed they were delivering justice and protecting their communities, no matter how horrific their methods. The darkest theory, however, claims deliberate manipulation behind the initial outbreak of the ninja scare. As Suharto's 3-decade-old authoritarian regime fell, some suspect elements of the old guard orchestrated the ninja violence to destabilize the country. The timing was suspicious. The slayings of religious leaders and community heads sowed chaos that undermined the new president's fragile government. Investigations later noted that the initial ninja attacks were highly organized and more like a coordinated paramilitary operation. The initial ninjas even cut power to villages and moved with trained precision, which suggested this wasn't the work of random mobs. Western observers speculated that rogue military officers loyal to Suharto were behind it, deliberately spreading terror to discredit the reform movement. Ultimately, no definitive answer emerged, and the 1998 East Java ninja scare remains a mystery that unfolded in distinct parts. While it appears that shadowy political figures may have been behind the initial attacks, these hits caused widespread mass hysteria. This mass hysteria, overlaid upon local cultural factors, ended up with villagers targeting anyone who they believed was a ninja wizard hybrid. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, merch store, and other channels. Just click the links in the description below. On April 4th, 1991, around 11:45 p.m., in the small town of Clinton, Missouri, 20-year-old Angela Marie Hammond was talking on a payphone when the unthinkable happened. Late that night, Angela, who was 4 months pregnant, had called her fiancé, Rob Schaefer, to tell him she was too tired to meet up as planned and would head home instead. Rob was only a few blocks away at his mother's house, babysitting his younger brother, and the payphone Angela used was in a grocery store parking lot not far from his location. During their conversation, Angela mentioned a strange man lurking nearby. She noticed he was driving an older model green Ford pickup truck that had been circling the block. The man parked near her used the adjacent phone briefly, then returned to his truck. She mentioned to Rob that he was using a flashlight inside the truck, as if he was searching for something within. When Angela asked if he needed to use her phone, he politely declined, saying he'd try again later. Angela gave Rob a quick description of the stranger. He was a filthy-looking bearded white male in overalls, wearing glasses. The truck he was driving included a distinctive decal of a fish jumping out of water on the back window. Despite giving this description, neither of them was overly alarmed at that moment. They resumed chatting, unaware of the horror about to unfold. Suddenly, Rob heard Angela scream on the other end of the line, and the phone abruptly dropped with a clatter. He immediately jumped into his car and raced toward the payphone to help her. As he sped toward downtown, a pickup truck roared past in the opposite direction. It was the same green Ford, and Angela was inside it, struggling with the driver. As the truck sped by, a voice from within shouted Rob's name in a chilling tone, indicating the extreme danger that Angela was in. Rob spun his car around and gave chase for about 2 miles, but in his frantic pursuit, the car's transmission failed. His vehicle broke down, and he could only watch helplessly as the truck's tail lights disappeared into the darkness ahead. In a matter of minutes, Angela Hammond had been violently abducted, and the young woman who had been on the phone was now gone without a trace. Rob immediately called police to report the abduction, and an intensive search was underway immediately. Angela's disappearance sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Clinton. Nothing like this had ever happened in the town before, and people were stunned that such a brazen crime could occur in their midst. Local law enforcement and volunteers sprang into action that night and over the following days. Police officers and townspeople scoured the area by air and on the ground, searching for any sign of Angela or the abductor's vehicle. The only solid clue was the description of the pickup truck, an older model green Ford with a distinctive decal in its rear window. Investigators hoped that if they could locate that truck, they would find Angela. The Missouri State Highway Patrol assisted by combing through vehicle registrations, generating a list of nearly 2,000 possible matches in the region. It was a daunting task to check them all, but authorities diligently followed up on each potential lead. Frustratingly, none of the vehicles investigated turned out to be the one involved in the abduction. The pickup and its driver had simply vanished. Aside from what Rob had reported, the investigators had little evidence to follow. With scant leads, police had to consider the possibility that the crime was not as it appeared. Investigators gave a hard look at Rob Schaefer, since his was the only first-hand account of what happened. However, Angela's family never doubted Rob's story for a moment, and he cooperated fully with the authorities. Within a week, police had verified Rob's account and cleared him as a suspect. It was evident that Rob had genuinely tried to save Angela and was devastated by her disappearance. As the investigation continued, police broadened their scope and wondered if Angela's abduction might be connected to other recent crimes in the area. They noted 2 other cases within about a 100-mile radius that had occurred in the months just before Angela vanished. 2 other women were slain nearby earlier in the year. Investigators feared that a single offender was behind all 3 incidents, targeting women in small Missouri towns. This led to early theories of a serial predator at work, putting the community on edge and prompting collaboration between multiple law enforcement agencies. Ultimately, however, the idea ended up coming to nothing, and as you'll see in a moment, a much more concrete theory of the case would form. Despite the lack of progress, Angela's story was kept in the public eye. The case garnered national attention and was even featured on Unsolved Mysteries, which brought wider awareness to the abduction. Notably, having her case featured on Unsolved Mysteries continues to pay dividends till this day. I first became familiar with Angela's story through that feature on the show, and I'm sure most of you watching also did as well, at least indirectly through other YouTubers who did. Numerous tips of varying quality came in as a result of this case reaching millions of additional people, but nothing led to a breakthrough. By the late 1990s, the investigation had stagnated. Officially, Angela Hammond's case remained open, but it seemed no closer to being solved than it was on the night she disappeared. In 2021, on the 30th anniversary of Angela's disappearance, investigators in Clinton revealed a startling new lead that cast the case in a very different light. Captain Paul Abbott of the Clinton Police Department, a veteran detective on Angela's case, announced a theory that Angela may have been an unintended target all along. His team had revisited an old piece of evidence, a threatening letter that arrived in the area around the time of the abduction. And if you're one of those people who just listens, you may want to check your screen now to look at this note. The letter, constructed from cutout magazine print, like a classic ransom note, was postmarked April 4th, 1991, the very day Angela vanished. It had been sent to a local man who had served as a confidential informant in a major drug case, and its message was dire. The writer threatened to get revenge by harming the informant's daughter, who was also named Angela. This raised the chilling possibility that the kidnappers had gone after the wrong Angela. The informant's daughter and Angela Hammond happened to share the same first name and were, according to investigators, close in age and appearance. Investigators now suspect that criminals seeking retaliation against the informant may have confused the two women and accidentally abducted Angela Hammond. In short, Angela's disappearance might have been a tragic case of mistaken identity. She could have been an innocent victim caught in the crosshairs of someone else's vendetta. As of 2025, detectives are still actively pursuing this narcotics-related lead, although no arrests have yet been made, and Angela's fate remains unknown. Interestingly, the man who pulled up while Angela was in the payphone initially went up to Angela and briefly used the phone next to her, or at least appeared to do so. He then went back to his truck and used his flashlight in the vehicle. My personal theory on this, given what the cops have said now, is that the abductor may have been looking at a photograph of the Angela he was targeting. On the first approach, he may have been unclear if this was the Angela he was looking for, and gone back to his vehicle to double-check the photograph. This would explain why he needed to turn a light on to get a clear view before coming back towards her. Given that the authorities mentioned that the targeted Angela and Angela Hammond looked similar, he may have thought he had confirmed her identity and made his move. In a dark twist, and this is pure speculation, I suspect there's a possibility that the organization responsible for the abduction may have eliminated both Angela and the kidnapper. The purpose of the abduction was to silence a key witness and return the correct Angela presumably unharmed. After all, the key informant would have no reason not to testify if something happened to his daughter. By kidnapping the wrong Angela, the abductor essentially botched the plans of a powerful criminal organization and may have led to members of their organization being locked away. If this speculative scenario is correct, both the abductor and Angela Hammond were slain to tie up the loose ends. More than 3 decades have passed since Angela Hammond vanished, but her case is not forgotten. Angela's mother has repeatedly pleaded for anyone with information, even the abductor, to come forward and reveal what happened. Investigators likewise insist they have never given up on the case, and the Clinton police remain committed to following every possible lead to find the truth. Notably, given the potential connection to the drug case, it's possible that the organization responsible for her disappearance is known to the authorities. The main stumbling block now may simply be getting together probable cause for a search warrant or finding a property that needs to be searched in connection with the case. On the morning of May 6, 1988, a couple out for a walk in rural Owen County, Kentucky, made a gruesome discovery. At first, they thought they had stumbled upon a dead goat in an overgrown field off Highway 330. As they drew closer, the couple expressed shock, realizing that they hadn't found an animal carcass, but rather a human being. Lying in the high grass was the body of an unidentified woman. She wasn't wearing anything except for a pair of men's dark brown socks, with her other clothing scattered nearby. The victim's face was unrecognizable due to decomposition, and parts of her left arm and hand were missing, likely the result of animal scavenging. Investigators determined she had been strangled several days earlier, classifying the case as a slaying. Given that the woman's body was found almost entirely unclothed, police suspected she may have been subject to an indecent assault. Unfortunately for investigators, this couldn't be confirmed by forensic evidence. The Jane Doe appeared to be a white female in early or mid-adulthood. An autopsy estimated her age between 25 and 40, around 5 feet 5 inches tall and 120 pounds. She had short, dark blonde hair cut in a bob style. Importantly, despite her age, she had no teeth and was speculated to have potentially worn dentures in life. A distinctive clue was a crude homemade tattoo of the name Steve on her upper arm. Despite these details, investigators at the scene found no identification, such as a wallet or papers on the body. Importantly, she was also determined to have likely given birth in the past. And I say importantly here, because this fact would, decades later, give this Jane Doe her identity back. Kentucky State Police detectives launched an intensive investigation. They took the woman's fingerprints and compared them against nationwide databases, hoping to find a match, but no match was found. Forensic experts created multiple facial reconstructions of the victim's likely appearance, distributing sketches in the hope that someone would recognize her. One truck driver came forward to report a possible sighting. He believed he had seen a woman matching the victim's description walking along a nearby highway around the time of the slaying. She was near a truck stop diner frequented by long-haul drivers. This raised the theory that the victim might have been a hitchhiker or transient, possibly picked up by an unknown assailant. Another theory considered by investigators is that she was working the lot. Unfortunately, this lead, like many others, could never be verified. Notably, just 8 days after the body was found, a major tragedy struck Kentucky. On May 14, 1988, the nation's worst drunk driving crash occurred in Carrollton, not far from Owen County, leading to the loss of 27 people. The overwhelming attention to that disaster diverted resources and media focus away from the Jane Doe investigation, causing it to stall. With no identity for the victim and no strong suspects, the case gradually went cold. In June 1988, about a month after the slaying, a family in Columbus, Ohio filed a missing persons report for a 38-year-old woman named Linda Bennett. She had long fallen out of regular contact with her family, but they suspected that something was different this time. At the time, authorities didn't connect this missing Ohio woman to the unidentified Kentucky victim. Bennett's family lived in another state and had only limited contact with her, so they were unaware of her fate. Unbeknownst to them, their loved one had already been found dead across state lines. For decades, the victim remained known only as the Owen County Jane Doe. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Kentucky, and her case lingered unsolved and largely forgotten, except by a handful of determined cold case investigators. Over the years, several theories emerged about who had slain Bennett and why. Early speculation centered on the idea of a serial predator targeting vulnerable women along highways. The fact that a witness possibly saw the victim near a truck stop led some to wonder if an unknown truck driver picked her up. Others questioned the mysterious Steve tattoo on the victim's arm. They considered whether Steve could have been a boyfriend or acquaintance involved in her disappearance. Some even speculated that this individual was what I'll euphemistically refer to as Bennett's manager. However, no person named Steve was ever linked to the case, and the tattoo ultimately did not lead to any breakthroughs. A much more concrete theory emerged in 2018 when one of America's most notorious serial predators, Samuel Little, confessed to a slaying that sounded eerily similar. Samuel Little was in prison for multiple slayings and had confessed to ending the lives of 93 women across the country between 1970 and 2005. Unlike some other predators who have claimed to have slain a large number of people, 60 victims of Little have been confirmed by investigators. In an interview with a Texas Ranger, Little recalled encountering a young white hippie woman at a strip club in Columbus, Ohio in the 80s. He said the woman, who fit Bennett's description, down to the short blonde bob, asked him for a ride to Miami. He described how they drove to Cincinnati and crossed into northern Kentucky, ending up in the Covington area. There, Little said, the woman heard music from a park festival and wanted to stop. Instead, Little drove onward into a remote area of Kentucky. According to Little's confession, he turned onto a winding dirt road up a hill, an isolated spot with no houses in sight, and strangled the woman in his car. He then dragged her body into the brush, leaving her partially concealed by vegetation near the hillside road. This account uncannily mirrored the circumstances of the Owen County Jane Doe's slaying. Little even drew a crude sketch of the woman's face, one of dozens of victim portraits he produced from memory. The FBI publicly released that sketch and description, noting that Little believed the victim was a 25-year-old he had slain around 1984 in Covington, in Kentucky. Investigators have acknowledged that Little's recollection of dates and ages was often inaccurate, and the crime he described likely took place a few years later. Bennett was slain in 1988 and was 38 years old, but is strongly suspected to be the very victim Little was describing. In other words, Linda Bennett may have been one of Samuel Little's many victims, a theory that gained substantial credence once her identity became known. After over 30 years of anonymity, the case saw a major breakthrough thanks to forensic science. In 2022, the Kentucky State Police partnered with Othram, a cutting-edge forensic DNA laboratory, to apply their proprietary forensic-grade genome sequencing. Othram's team succeeded in extracting DNA and building a comprehensive profile from the degraded samples. Also, just to get ahead of the inevitable comments, no, I'm not sponsored by Othram, and yes, I wish I was. Instead, I only get the usual suspects reach out to me to try to sponsor their crap products. You already know the brands. Using forensic genetic genealogy, they traced the unknown woman's family tree and generated investigative leads. In the fall of 2022, those leads led to a man in Columbus, Ohio, the adult son of a woman who had gone missing in 1988. The man provided a DNA sample, and in December 2022, authorities announced the result. The Owen County Jane Doe was positively identified as Linda Bennett. As it stands right now, Linda Bennett has her name back and her fate is known. The woman described by Little is believed by some to be Bennett, and it's quite clear that the resemblance between the two is uncanny. The sketch done by Little looks extremely similar to the reconstructions of Linda Bennett. However, the discrepancy in age remains a major factor. Linda Bennett had lived a hard life and appears to have looked substantially older than her 38 years. The woman described by Bennett, on the other hand, was described as a young, free-spirited hippie type, which seems to run contrary to where Linda Bennett was at in her life at that time. Unfortunately, no DNA evidence from the perpetrator was preserved from the scene, which cuts out that potential avenue to solve this case. Further, given what the truck driver said about potentially seeing Bennett, any finding of biological evidence may not have been sufficient to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Of course, that brings me back to the truck driver theory. The only eyewitness that placed her at the scene was a truck driver, which runs contrary to Samuel Little's account. Unfortunately, the Carrollton bus crash happened about a week after, taking up virtually all resources that were assigned to the case according to the Kentucky State Police. Given this, it's possible that early evidence slipped through the cracks, potentially leaving Linda Bennett's case an unsolved mystery forever. In 1972, a police officer on a late-night patrol outside Loveland, Ohio, encountered a creature crouching by the road. Under the glare of his headlights, it appeared roughly 3 to 4 feet tall, with leathery greenish skin and startlingly frog-like features. The being stared back at the officer with unblinking eyes, then abruptly stood upright on 2 legs and scrambled over the guardrail, vanishing down toward the Little Miami River. In that eerie moment, a local folktale leapt from murky riverbanks into the public spotlight, becoming the stuff of riveting tales for decades to come. It wasn't the first time something strange had been spotted skittering around Loveland. In fact, the legend of the so-called Loveland Frog began many years earlier, on a lonely road in 1955. As the story goes, a traveling salesman was driving through the area late one night when his headlights illuminated an unbelievable scene. He slammed on the brakes to see 3 small figures standing by the roadside, each about 3 to 4 feet tall with wrinkled, leathery skin and frog-like faces. The creatures were reportedly bipedal, walking upright on long, frog-like hind legs, and had webbed hands and feet. One version of the tale even claims the stranger watched in astonishment as one of the frog-faced beings raised a wand and began shooting sparks, apparently as a warning. If this version of events is to be believed, this suggests that this traveling salesman may have encountered a gathering of frog wizards in the wild. With details as fantastical as this, the 1950s incident hopped on the lily pads between local folklore and outright science fiction. Notably, some have taken the odd use of technology during that encounter to suggest that the Loveland Frog wasn't a cryptid encounter, but rather a close encounter of the third kind. That said, this initial story doesn't include the mention of any craft or vehicle associated with the frog wizards. 1972 was the year the Loveland Frog legend truly grew legs and left the pond, leaping into the annals of both cryptozoology and urban legends. After the officer's fateful initial sighting on that early March night, word of the encounter spread internally, and other officers were understandably skeptical. But just 2 weeks later, on March 17, 1972, an early St. Patrick's Day morning, a second Loveland police officer had a run-in that would solidify the creature's fame. He was driving in the same riverside area when he saw what looked like an animal lying in the road. The officer wasn't sure if the creature was dead or alive, but trust me when I say that he would be making sure the animal was deceased very soon. As the officer got out of his cruiser for a closer look at the creature suddenly stirred. It rose from a crouch and scurried away toward the roadside ditch, in a manner that seemed eerily similar to the previous officer's description. Startled and unsure what he was dealing with, the officer, apparently inspired by the release of Dirty Harry in the previous year, drew his service weapon and started blasting wildly. The unknown animal flopped over the guardrail, apparently injured, before it eventually disappeared into the dark brush. However, unlike a typical cryptid story, this encounter didn't end there. The cop managed to track down the creature's body, or so he later claimed, and hauled the carcass into his trunk to show the officer who had initially encountered it. Far from an otherworldly frog humanoid, it turned out to be something far more ordinary, a large iguana, about 3 feet long. The iguana was missing its tail, which likely made it look strange at first glance in the dark. The cops reasoned that this cold-blooded reptile must have been someone's pet that either escaped or had been released after growing too big. In a 2016 interview, the cop who gunned the iguana down declared that it was, quote, half dead anyway, and implied that he had just put the poor creature out of its misery. And yet, despite the officer's reports and the neat conclusion, this tadpole of a tail took on a life of its own, losing its tail and growing legs. Some in the community were not entirely convinced that the iguana explained everything. They didn't accept that an iguana would have been able to survive out in the wild for 2 weeks, between the initial sighting and the slaying of the creature 2 weeks later. Simply put, locals kept repeating the story, and the Loveland frog refused to just croak. In the summer of 2016, the legend came leaping back into the headlines, thanks, oddly enough, to a popular phone game about strange creatures out in the wild. That year, 2 teenagers were out playing Pokemon Go one night near Lake Isabella, just outside Loveland. That night, they reportedly stumbled upon something straight out of a campfire story. In the glow of their phone screens and the moonlight on the water, they saw a giant frog by the lake's edge. Except this was no ordinary frog. It stood up on its hind legs and started advancing towards them in a menacing fashion. One of the startled observers, a local man named Sam Jacobs, managed to snap a few photos of the creature. The photograph was dark and grainy, showing only the silhouette of a frog-like figure and 2 glowing eyes in the night. Take a look at the photograph on your screen now, and let me know in the comments what it looks like to you. To me, this doesn't look anything like a frog whatsoever, given the location of the eyes. For long-time fans of my channel, you're going to appreciate what I have to say next. This looks like a classic case of an owl misidentification. This is just an owl's eyes bouncing your camera flash off the thin, shiny layer that helps the bird see in the dark. Also, look closer. The body under the eyes widens, then tapers like a bowling pin, which is exactly what a roosting owl looks like when it tucks its wings. Frogs don't generally taper off like that, at least not any that I've seen. In the end, there's essentially 2 options with respect to this cryptid. The first is that Loveland is inhabited by large frog-like creatures who can shoot sparks from wands. The second is that the whole thing just comes out of a weird iguana mishap and a trigger-happy cop with a vendetta against reptiles. Which version of events you choose to believe is ultimately up to you. For nearly 3 decades, the identity of an elderly woman found buried in the Southern California desert remained unknown. In March 1994, a group of hunters in the remote Colorado desert near Chiriaco Summit in the Coachella Valley discovered a set of human remains. This woman's remains had been uncovered by a particularly heavy rainstorm which recently hit the area. Authorities determined the victim was a white female between 70 and 85 years old. She had thin white hair about 5 inches long and was found clad only in a disposable adult diaper and a pink robe with no tags or labels. No form of identification was with the body, and investigators quickly concluded that she had been slain. The mystery of who this woman was and how she ended up in a shallow grave would haunt detectives for decades. The discovery on March 9, 1994, set off an immediate investigation by the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. The remains were located several miles off any paved road, indicating that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal the body in the open desert. An autopsy and examination of the body provided some critical clues about the victim's condition. She was petite, approximately 5 feet 1 inch tall and about 100 pounds, and appeared frail and sickly. Notably, medical examiners found severe bed sores all over the backside of her body. These painful pressure sores indicated that the woman had likely been bedridden and completely immobilized for a long period before her death. This suggested she had been under someone else's care and likely in extremely poor health. Investigators also observed that the elderly woman had no teeth and was not wearing any dentures at the time she was found. She had no jewelry or personal effects on her, and the pink bathrobe she wore bore no identification marks. All of these factors made identifying her extremely difficult, as there were no obvious initial clues to her name or background. With no ID on the body, investigators turned to missing persons reports and public outreach. They created a composite sketch of the victim's face in hopes that someone would recognize her. This sketch, a penciled rendering of an elderly woman with her hair pulled back, was circulated in local media and to various agencies. Authorities were hopeful that an acquaintance, neighbor, or relative might see the likeness and come forward with a name. Additionally, given the victim's advanced age and medical condition, police checked with nursing homes and hospitals to see if any patients had gone missing. They also looked for any reports of missing elderly women in Southern California around that time, but despite these efforts, no matches were found. No family members contacted the sheriff's department, and no caretakers reported a patient missing. The anonymous victim came to be known only as the Chiriaco Summit Jane Doe, and as months turned into years, the case went cold. Throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, the unidentified victim's case sat on the shelf with few new leads. In 2009, the case details were entered into the newly formed NamUs database. This ensured that her physical description and circumstances were accessible to law enforcement nationwide. But even with wider circulation, her identity remained a mystery. Periodically, investigators revisited the case, but without a name or any new evidence, progress was limited. The passage of time led to growing speculation about who this woman was and how she met her fate. One puzzling aspect was that no missing person report ever matched the victim. In fact, it was later confirmed that the Jane Doe, as she then was, had never been officially reported missing by anyone. For law enforcement, this was a troubling clue. It suggested that those who knew the victim in life either were unaware of her disappearance or had reasons not to report it. Over the years, the leading theory that took hold was that the victim may have been slain by someone close to her. They may have found themselves unable or unwilling to continue caring for a sick elderly relative. The presence of bed sores supported the idea that she had been bedridden and completely dependent on others. However, without an identity, it was impossible to confirm any such theory. It wasn't clear whether she was a local resident of the Coachella Valley or brought in from elsewhere, potentially even out of state. All authorities knew for certain was that an elderly woman had been slain somewhere else and then dumped in the desert, and nobody had stepped forward to even report her missing. As the case languished, forensic technology was advancing. By the 2010s, DNA analysis had become a game changer in cracking unsolved cases such as this. In the 90s, DNA testing was in its infancy and typically required substantial good samples. But by the 2010s, even old degraded remains could sometimes yield a DNA profile. Another problem was that DNA could only be tested against people who were in databases themselves, or had very close relatives in them. In this case, biological samples had been preserved, but earlier attempts to identify her through DNA were unsuccessful because there was no matching profile in law enforcement databases. She had likely never been arrested or entered into any criminal database, and her immediate family's DNA wasn't in any database either. Traditional forensic DNA comparison hit a dead end, but the new technique of forensic genetic genealogy offered a different approach. In 2021, the Riverside County Cold Case Unit decided to apply advanced DNA techniques to the decades-old mystery. They partnered with Othram, a Texas-based laboratory specializing in cold case identifications. Othram's team was able to extract DNA and use their innovative forensic-grade genome sequencing technique to build a comprehensive genetic profile of the victim. This process involves sequencing hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, far more than standard law enforcement DNA tests, enabling even distant familial matches to be detected. Once Othram had developed the profile, the data was returned to Riverside County investigators for genealogical analysis. Armed with this new DNA profile, investigators began to construct the victim's family tree. Little by little, distant cousins and relatives were identified through shared DNA markers. Researchers followed these clues like branches, working backward to find a common ancestor, and then forward through family lines. It was a painstaking process, but eventually it led to a promising name: Claire Antonia Deverak. Once her identity was known, detectives and journalists began digging into Claire Deverak's life story. Records showed that she was born Claire Antonia Callis in 1907 in Chicago, Illinois. Not much is known about her early life, though it is known that her parents had been German immigrants. In 1939, she married a man named Joseph Deverak, and the couple started a family, and they had 2 children, named Donald and Joanne. Sometime in the late 40s, the Deveraks moved to Florida, settling in Pinellas County, where he worked as a farmer while she was a homemaker. After spending a number of years in Florida, the family eventually moved west to Arizona. By the 1980s, they were living in Scottsdale, and in 1986, Joseph Deverak passed away while they were still residing there. Now widowed and in her late 70s, Claire apparently decided to relocate again. Sometime after her husband's death, she moved to California's Coachella Valley, possibly to be closer to one of her adult children or other family. She acquired a home in the area, and this is the residence from which she ultimately disappeared, sometime in the early 90s. A striking fact emerged during the investigation of Claire's background. Despite her sudden disappearance and violent end, no missing persons report was ever filed. Neither her children nor any other family or neighbors reported her as missing to the authorities. This explains why law enforcement had no leads in 1994. Claire wasn't listed as a missing person in any database. The lack of a report is now a critical element of the mystery. It hints that someone close to Claire might have known more about her fate and chosen to stay silent. Identifying Claire was a major breakthrough, but it was only the first step in resolving this cold case. With her name and history known, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department has turned their focus toward finding out who was responsible for her death. The case is now being investigated as an active slaying, albeit one that's 30 years old. Publicly, authorities have remained tight-lipped about any suspects or persons of interest. However, the very nature of the crime suggests a limited pool of potential perpetrators, likely those in Claire's immediate circle. Because she was elderly and infirm, she wouldn't have been physically capable of traveling far on her own. Instead, the evidence points to someone who had access to this vulnerable woman. At this stage, her cause of death hasn't been publicly released, but it was deemed a slaying by the coroner back in 1994. So what happens next to bring justice for Claire Deverak? Aside from the obvious first step of taking a very close look into her family, there are some other less obvious steps that could be taken. An effective investigation may begin with a close review of Claire's financial footprint, treating her bank and Social Security activity as a potential roadmap to her final months. Unusual ATM use or transfers to third parties may signal financial exploitation, pointing toward a caregiver or family member who had access to her accounts. Further, if someone kept cashing her checks after her body was found, that would raise suspicions on that person significantly. Next, authorities could systematically examine records from care homes and home health agencies in the Coachella Valley area. Intake forms, admission dates, and nursing notes could reveal when Claire last received professional care and who was responsible for her daily needs. Cross-referencing staffing rosters with incident reports may uncover witnesses to neglect. Unfortunately, these records may now largely be destroyed, not as an attempt to eliminate evidence, but due to regulatory record-keeping requirements. Finally, the authorities may want to consider a further investigation of the shallow grave. Given advancements in ground-penetrating radar, it's always possible that further evidence which could fully solve this case remains out there in the desert. The Bible has been the subject of countless studies, interpretations, and debates over the millennia. One of the more intriguing and controversial theories associated with it is the concept of the Bible Code, also known as the Torah Code. This theory suggests that hidden within the Hebrew text of the Bible are coded messages that can predict future events or reveal divine knowledge. The Bible Code is essentially a purported method of finding hidden messages within the text of the Bible, particularly the Hebrew Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The concept hinges on equidistant letter sequences, also known as ELS. In this method, letters are selected at regular intervals within the text to form new words or phrases. For example, starting from a specific letter in Genesis and skipping every 50th letter might spell out a word or phrase. Proponents argue that these hidden messages can predict specific events, identify names, and reveal patterns of divine significance. The idea of finding hidden messages in the Bible isn't entirely new. The concept can be traced back to Jewish mysticism, particularly Kabbalah, which emphasizes deeper esoteric meanings within the Torah and other traditional Jewish texts. The modern version of the Bible Code, however, gained prominence in the late 20th century. In 1976, an Israeli mathematician named Dr. Eliyahu Rips, alongside Doron Witztum and Yoav Rosenberg, applied computer algorithms to search for equidistant letter sequences in the Bible. Their work culminated in a 1994 paper published in the academic journal Statistical Science. The paper claimed to find statistically significant patterns, such as names of famous rabbis encoded alongside their birth and death dates in the book of Genesis. This sparked public interest, but it wasn't until journalist Michael Drosnin published his book The Bible Code in 1997 that the theory exploded in popularity. Drosnin's book was a bestseller and presented bold claims, including predictions of future events like nuclear wars and natural disasters. While his work popularized the concept, it also drew sharp criticism from both scholars and skeptics. One of the Bible Code's most provocative claims is its ability to predict future events. Drosnin, for instance, claimed the Bible Code predicted the slaying of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. However, of course, it's much less impressive, or not impressive at all, to claim to have predicted an event after the event has occurred. Statisticians and skeptics have been especially critical of the Bible Code. One major critique is that equidistant letter sequences are not unique to the Bible. Researchers have demonstrated that similar patterns can be found in any sufficiently large text. For example, an Australian mathematician used the same methods to find quote-unquote predictions in Moby Dick by Herman Melville, including the slayings of JFK and MLK. Additionally, the statistical methods employed by Bible code proponents have been questioned. Some argue that by selectively choosing starting points, intervals, and contexts, one can produce virtually any desired result. But secular scholars aren't the only ones who have taken their opportunity to dunk on the Bible code. Religious scholars also point out that the Bible code's reliance on the exact text of the Hebrew Bible is problematic. Over centuries, slight variations in manuscripts have emerged, raising the question of which version of the text is the correct one for such analyses. Even small changes in spelling could drastically alter the outcomes of equidistant letter sequences. Further, many observant people find that the Bible code is at best a distraction from the true meaning of the Bible. They argue that the Bible's spiritual and moral teachings should take precedence over speculative claims about hidden codes. In my view, the real problem with the Bible code is the fact that it has no apparent predictive powers whatsoever. It's essentially the occult version of a cheap parlor trick using a book that's held as sacred to a large percentage of the world's population. Bushido, often translated as the way of the warrior, is famously known as the moral and ethical code of the samurai, Japan's warrior class. It evokes romantic images of armored swordsmen upholding ideals of honor, loyalty, and bravery. Yet historians have long debated whether a unified code of Bushido truly guided samurai throughout history, or if our modern idea of Bushido is largely a later invention. When we look at Japan's medieval and early modern periods, we find that samurai did follow certain ethical ideals, such as loyalty to one's lord, personal honor, and courage in battle. These values developed slowly over the centuries. For example, as early as the 13th century Kamakura period, warrior tales emphasized bravery and honor, like announcing one's name before combat, as virtues for samurai. However, there was no single formal Bushido code in these eras. In fact, the Japanese word Bushido, literally warrior's way, is rarely found in pre-modern texts. The concept of a samurai honor code certainly existed in various forms, but it was not a fixed written doctrine universally followed across all samurai families. Different domains and eras had their own house codes and philosophies for warriors. Many famous samurai texts like Hagakure or Budo Shoshinshu do articulate samurai virtues. However, these were written long after the age of constant warfare, often as nostalgia or guidance during the long peace of the Edo period. Notably, Hagakure itself was not widely read until the 20th century, when it became celebrated as a Bushido classic. Historical evidence also shows that actual samurai behavior did not always match the later Bushido ideal. Loyalty, for instance, was often pragmatic. During the age of warring states in the 15th and 16th centuries, many samurai changed allegiances when it was advantageous. Scholars have noted that the image of unwavering fealty to one lord, or the emperor, was largely a product of Edo period storytelling and not the reality before 1600. Early chronicles even describe clans intentionally splitting their members' loyalties between rival sides to ensure the family's survival regardless of the conflict's outcome. Treachery, mercenary rewards, and brutality were not uncommon in samurai warfare, much like in any other warrior culture. Chivalrous individuals certainly existed, as they do in all societies, and samurai epics celebrate heroes who died for honor or loyalty. But as one early 20th century scholar, B.H. Chamberlain, observed, quote, "Bushido, as an institution or a code of rules, has never existed. Those later accounts of a strict code were, he argued, fabricated out of whole cloth, a mythologized retrofitting of history. While that may be an extreme view, It highlights the fact that our modern notion of an eternal, unchanging samurai code is oversimplified. If Bushido was not a formal medieval code, how did it become so famous? The answer lies in the Meiji era and Japan's nation-building efforts. After the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the samurai class was effectively abolished as a social status. Yet paradoxically, it was after the samurai were gone that Bushido as a concept truly flourished. During Japan's rapid modernization, leaders and thinkers sought symbols of national identity that could inspire unity and pride. They began to recast samurai ideals into a modern context, a process one historian has called the inventing of Bushido. By the 1880s and 1890s, Japanese intellectuals started referencing Bushido in writings, presenting it as a long-standing samurai principle of loyalty and honor. In reality, as studies have shown, the concept of Bushido was largely unknown in Japan before the 1890s, and only gained wide currency after 1900. This was no coincidence. It aligned with Japan's rising nationalism and its military victories. Simply put, Bushido was being reinvented to meet contemporary needs, and also provided a homegrown framework for thinkers who felt Japan was becoming overly westernized. Further, it wouldn't have made sense for the general populace to have any meaningful understanding of Bushido prior to this time. When the samurai class existed as an institution, they ruled over peasants who didn't share the same rights, privileges, or responsibilities that they did. As Japan modernized, these varying social classes needed to be formed into a cohesive history. One of the most influential figures in this reinvention was Nitobe Inazo, who in 1900 published Bushido, The Soul of Japan. This book, which was written in English for a Western audience, stitched together samurai anecdotes, Confucian ethics, and his own ideals to explain Japan's samurai spirit to the world. Tellingly, Nitobe portrayed Bushido as a timeless code of virtues: benevolence, honesty, honor, loyalty, akin to a Japanese form of chivalry. He downplayed violent or feudal aspects and emphasized moral virtues, making Bushido palatable and even admirable to Western readers. The timing was perfect. Japan's stunning victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 drew global attention, and observers latched onto Bushido as an explanation for Japanese soldiers' bravery. Nitobe's romanticized version of Bushido thus profoundly shaped both Western and Japanese perceptions. Ironically, the Japanese public themselves read Nitobe's ideas only after they'd been validated abroad, and a Japanese translation of his book did not appear until 1908. During the Meiji and Taisho periods, Bushido concepts were woven into Japan's military ethos and education system. Textbooks extolled samurai loyalty and sacrifice, which were now fully transferred to loyalty to the emperor and nation. The context was changed from loyalty to one's immediate lord in a feudal-type structure to loyalty to the emperor and the Japanese state. By the 1930s, this had evolved into what was called Imperial Bushido. Under Imperial Japanese ideology, especially leading into World War II, Bushido was used as a rallying moral code for soldiers and citizens. The feudal loyalty of samurai to their lord was reinterpreted as absolute loyalty to the Japanese state and people, both of which were embodied by the emperor himself. Self-sacrifice and honor in death were emphasized to encourage military fanaticism, contributing to phenomena like kamikaze pilots and the ethic of fighting to the last man. The government actively promoted this warrior spirit. For example, schoolchildren were taught samurai stories of selfless loyalty, and soldiers were issued manuals on the imperial way of the warrior. This state-crafted Bushido stressed obedience, courage, and death before dishonor. Bushido had thus been nationalized, turned into a tool to foster unity and militarism. However, when Japan was defeated in 1945, the Bushido-fueled militaristic spirit largely collapsed. Many Japanese became disillusioned with these ideals, seeing them as having been misused to justify war and sacrifice. In the post-war era, direct references to Bushido in Japan became rare and even awkward, except among die-hard nationalists. The post-Meiji journey of Bushido shows how a once obscure concept was repackaged in modern times, partly invented and partly resurrected to serve contemporary ideologies.